as a port operator, the first word that I wish to use is to be a responsible port operator. Now, the word responsibility encompasses with itself a transition which we are seeing very actively from a certain kind of a energy to a new wave of energy that will come to the world. Let's not forget, and while there's a creeping sense across India that we are being called upon, and I'm glad to hear from Amlanji, as I'm glad to connect with him again, that in the World Hydrogen Conference, we've taken a space and an optics. At the same time, the responsibility that hovers on India at large and the maritime sector, therefore, is to see that we handle this transition and meet the goals that we have promised. What, in fact, on the maritime sector as a responsible port operator that APSEZ is, and doing close to about 430 million metric tons of cargo of the 1600 that has been done in India, which corresponds to 27%, is that we would go through all that was spoken in the first half about, let's say, electrification. Today, you will be happy to note that we took this pledge in 2022, but by 25, we would become carbon neutral. While we may have just missed it, but we are very close to that. We pledged ourselves that by 2040, we will take net zero, which is extremely challenging. And to do that, it's a combination of things. It doesn't stand in splendid isolation, as it were. So all the ports of APSEZ at first are going to be entirely RE powered. To do that, not only within the ports, and I congratulate Chairman VOC Sushantji and Deputy Chairman Rajeshji for taking this great initiative. I also want to tell you that the port sector of India comprises, after the beautiful example of PPP, nearly 45% is done in the non-major ports. It's time that the ministry recognizes the revolution that is happening in the non-major ports. Mundra, for example, is India's port, which has been the pride of place for doing 100 million first, 150. And when I seen Rotterdam today, Mundra did last year more than 200. But more than the 200, with all humility I say, and which we handle, is that nearly every third container of India passes through Mundra port, again in all humility. But how do we handle them? The entire set of cranes are electrically fed. The entire set of GSUs, entire cranes and ITVs, the ITV story is still happening. All ITVs, at the moment, we've got close to about 400 ITVs. And the more important fact is, when we pledged ourselves, we were the first to undertake this transition. While a lot has been spoken, very silently, APSEZ has been undertaking this transition, as I come back to the word, a responsible port operator. So that responsibility encompasses that you have a chart for yourself. You're aware of the energy transition that is taking place. You're aware that your country's energy needs are still largely thermal oriented. You're also aware that in the ports, the transition that will happen more than 200 megawatts we consume is entirely green fed from a combination that we do in Khavda. Whereas I was telling the other speakers during the break that while we'll be doing from hybrid power close to 30 gigawatts by 2030, we're already close to about little more than 5.5 gigawatts at the end of this financial year. Now, all that is being routed to our ports across the country through power of streaming the power, and it'll be green based. The other thing about net zero is the indices. Now, it's time in the corporatization of the Indian port sector. You'll find that today most ports are becoming landlord models. You look at JNPT, it's an entirely landlord port. Paradeep is en route to become, and I'm sure VOC and others, you already have a landlord model in the state government concessions. You'll have Mundra, you'll have Dhamra, you'll have Kattupalli here in Tamil Nadu, you'll have Karikal here in Tamil Nadu. All this, the transition that we are undertaking towards net zero is a responsible transition. And when I say this, how do we get indiced? Because the funding that we are going to take, and here the difference between a major and a non-major port, while the government is a sovereign fund, the non-major ports have to go to the market to take funds. Today, while green financing is a subject after this, I shudder to think that we can go to raise bonds and monies in India if you are not valued by indices such as CDP, Sustainalytics and all. And it's with all humility and privilege, I would say, amongst the peers that are benchmarked and the 10 best port operators in the world, India ranks with APSEZ in all humility, as I said, among the 10. And our journey perhaps going to be the fastest. I congratulate you to the major ports. There is, while the green hydrogen is taking place, in one of our ports, in all the ports we have begun, in Gopalpur port, which is very newly acquired, we've got this offtake agreement. We're not just setting up green hydrogen players coming in through PPP models, but offtake agreements being signed by countries which would not be able to produce green hydrogen at their spaces at lesser cost. Eventually cost and technology going to be the kings of the world as we go ahead. I'm not even talking about digitalization has been spoken, but cost and technology, when this transition happens, countries like Korea, countries like Japan, they were more actively pursuing our transition of hydrogen that we produce in India, and we transport them, as fuel in the maritime sector, also to give them their security when they do their part of the transition. All this is weaved into the strategy which Honorable Prime Minister said by 2070. We in APSCs believe our transition will happen by 2040, and we've taken all the corrective steps. So valuing yourself, and I will encourage as we go forward to all the major ports, it's time you started valuing yourself on benchmark statistics. Introduce Sustainalytics, introduce CDP, introduce those who evaluate as to how I'm conducting my businesses. Am I within the contours of the green transition that is taking place? Well, that's very important. So I come back to what I began, that as a responsible port operator, ESG is going to drive the force. The driving force of ports will be governed by ESG. I think there were references by Madam Malini. She wouldn't recollect. I'm pleasure to seeing her up for quite a hiatus time. But I will tell you, the ESG is what is going to determine and govern the course of the ports in the future. Are the ports of India, major ports and non-major ports, prepared to recognize this transition? If you are, then you will chart out your territories. Okay. What is ESG? I would love to tell, but many people would not be knowing and accepting that this is the world. Today, with the IMECC, which has not been spoken of, India's desire to get into the IMECC's corridor, we'll have a larger share in the world supply chain. When we do a largest part in the world supply chain, we're looking at transporting Indian goods, notwithstanding what is happening about certain countries imposing 25% tariff on us. It's not for me to comment, and penalties that come. The fact is, when India weaves itself into a larger supply chain of the world and will become a China plus one strategy, and we're going to be a manufacturing powerhouse, which is a desire, because that is so well linked to India's goal for poverty alleviation, etc., and for general welfare of Indian citizens. So one of the goals is to route Indian products through the IMECC route. So for the Western India, the East would also play a part. The Western India, and especially ports like Bardhaman, which is coming up, JNPT, Mundra, Kandla, are well positioned to get into this economic corridor, which is go to the Far East, ports like Haifa, which were weaved into that, and we run a terminal in Haifa, again getting across to Europe. While we haven't got across to Rotterdam so far, because most of the Indian products will get into US and Western Europe, and they do route themselves. That is the necessity to be aware. So IMECC and our preparedness for that is also another fact that in the green transition that we should be taking up. So these are some of the competitive thoughts. If we do come back, I will share further thoughts on that. But the fact remains, as I said, a responsible port operator recognizes the responsibility of operating itself within the contours of being green, sustainable, and ESG earmarked. That's the way of the future. Thank you so much.